Whispers on Blackpeak Mountain. Deep in the heart of the Himalayas, a forbidden peak loomed over the valley. Blackpeak Mountain was cursed, the villagers said. No one who climbed it ever returned. The stories were enough to scare most people away, except for Daniel and his team. Daniel, an experienced mountaineer, had spent years conquering the world's deadliest summits. But Blackpeak fascinated him. He didn't believe in curses, only in challenges. So, he and his 3 companions, Mark, Lisa, and Aaron, set out to conquer the haunted mountain. The ascent. The climb started smoothly, but as they ascended past the tree line, an eerie silence settled around them. The wind, which had howled below, suddenly stopped. Not even the crunch of their boots in the snow seemed to make a sound. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the wind carrying distant voices. But soon, they were everywhere. Words they couldn't understand. Some sounded close, others far away. Lisa froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Just the wind," Aaron said, though his voice wavered. But there was no wind. The cabin. That night, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a wooden cabin, abandoned and half buried in the snow. Strange, since no one was supposed to live here. They decided to rest inside. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood. The whispers grew louder. In the middle of the night, Mark jolted awake. Someone was breathing next to him. But when he turned his flashlight on, there was no one there, only a deep impression in the snow beside his sleeping bag. Then the door slammed open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, thin, its face hidden by shadows. It didn't move. It just watched. Lisa screamed. The flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. The descent into madness. The next morning, they decided to turn back. But something was wrong. Their tracks from the day before had vanished. The mountain had erased them. Then Aaron disappeared. One moment he was walking with them, the next, he was gone. No scream. No sign of a struggle. Only the whispers, growing louder, laughing. Night fell again. Daniel and the remaining 2 huddled together, barely sleeping. Lisa sobbed, whispering to herself. Mark held his ice axe tight, staring into the darkness. Then Lisa stood up. Without a word, she walked into the snow, her eyes blank. "Lisa." Daniel ran after her, but the moment he grabbed her, she turned and smiled. Her eyes were pitch black. "You should not have come," she whispered. Then she vanished into the blizzard. The last survivor. By morning, it was just Daniel. The whispers were deafening now, speaking his name. He ran. He didn't stop until he reached the base of the mountain. When the villagers found him, his face was frozen in terror. He never spoke again. Years later, another team attempted to climb Blackpeak. They found an old wooden cabin, its walls covered in deep scratches. And outside, half buried in the snow, was a camera. The last recording, Lisa staring into the lens, her eyes black as the abyss. "You should not have come." The Forgotten Path. Prologue. The Vanishing Trail. The town of Stillwater had a legend, one that parents whispered to their children to keep them from wandering too far into the mountains. Stay on the marked trails. Never stray into the forgotten path. It wasn't just a ghost story. Over the past 50 years, hikers had gone missing, their bodies never recovered. A few survivors had returned, their minds shattered, speaking of things in the woods that shouldn't exist. Ethan Gray had heard the stories growing up. Now a documentary filmmaker, he wanted to uncover the truth. With his best friend Jason, his girlfriend Sophie, and their cameraman Ben, he set off into the mountains to find the infamous Forgotten Path. They never should have gone. Chapter 1. The First Omen. The first 2 days were uneventful. The group hiked through stunning landscapes, setting up camp near a river. Ethan filmed everything, interviewing locals, capturing the eerie silence of the deeper woods. Then, on the 3rd day, they found the marker. A wooden post, half buried in the dirt, its carvings worn away by time. The sign pointed toward a narrow, overgrown trail leading into the dark heart of the forest. Ben hesitated. "Guys, maybe this isn't a good idea." But Ethan was determined. "This is why we're here. No one's documented this place. It's our chance to be the first." Reluctantly, they stepped onto the Forgotten Path. That's when the woods changed. The air grew thick, heavy with a silence that pressed against them. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of their boots and an unsettling feeling that they were being watched. Then they found the cabin. Chapter 2, The Cabin in the Woods. Hidden beneath ancient trees, the cabin looked centuries old. The wood was warped, covered in deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way inside, or out. Sophie frowned. It feels wrong. They pushed open the door. Inside, the air was damp and stale. The walls were covered in strange symbols, crude carvings of spirals and jagged figures. In the center of the room stood a chair, tied with rotting ropes. Something had been restrained there. Jason picked up an old notebook from the floor. The pages were filled with frantic handwriting. It whispers at night. It knows my name. I must not sleep. If I do, it will take me too. It is inside me now. The last page was smeared with blood. Ben muttered, "We should leave. Now." Then the door slammed shut on its own. And the whispers began. Chapter 3, The Watchers. That night, they set up camp near the cabin, too afraid to sleep inside. The fire crackled weakly, barely piercing the darkness. Then came the first scream. Jason shot up. "Did you hear that?" A distant wail echoed through the trees. It didn't sound human. Ben turned the camera toward the woods. "There's something out there." A shape stood at the tree line. Too tall, too thin. Its eyes gleamed like dying embers. Then it moved. Not walking, gliding between the trees, impossibly fast. Panic set in. "We have to go," Sophie whispered. But the path they came from was gone. The forest had changed. Chapter 4, The Descent into Madness. They ran blindly through the woods, but every direction led them back to the cabin. It was as if the forest was shifting around them, trapping them. Then Jason was taken. One moment he was behind them, the next, gone. His scream cut off mid-breath. Ben turned the camera around wildly, catching glimpses of something in the trees. A figure, its limbs contorted, its mouth stretching open too wide. They barricaded themselves inside the cabin, panting. The whispers grew louder. Then Jason's voice came from outside. "Let me in." Ethan hesitated, his hand trembling. "Over the door. Please, it's cold out here." But the voice was wrong. Off-key. Like something wearing Jason's voice. They didn't open the door. Chapter 5, The Forgotten Ones. By dawn, Ben was missing. He had walked into the woods in a trance, mumbling about the whispers calling his name. Sophie sobbed, clutching Ethan's arm. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" The air grew colder. The trees bent toward them, their bark splitting open like gaping mouths. Then Ethan saw them, figures moving in the distance. Not just one. Dozens. They watched silently, their bodies twitching unnaturally. Sophie grabbed Ethan's face. "We can't let them take us. Promise me." Ethan nodded, gripping the last flare from his bag. The whispers became screams. The figures rushed forward. The flare ignited, red light flashing through the darkness. In that brief moment, Ethan saw Jason and Ben among them. Their eyes hollow. Their skin stretched too tight. Then everything went black. Epilogue. The Last Survivor. A week later, hikers found Ethan wandering near the town's edge. His clothes were torn, his eyes vacant. When asked what happened, he muttered one thing. "The path never lets you leave." Sophie was never found. Neither were Jason or Ben. But at night, if you stand at the entrance of the forgotten path, you can still hear the whispers. Calling your name. Whispers from the Forgotten Graveyard. A horror story for a 30-minute video. 1. The Dare at Midnight. It was a chilly autumn night when Aeon, Rafi, Niloy, and Tisha stood outside the old Shyamapur cemetery. The rusty iron gate loomed over them, its hinges creaking slightly in the wind. It had been abandoned for decades, a place avoided even by the bravest villagers. Legend had it that those who entered at midnight heard whispers of the dead, calling out for company. Some said no one who entered after dark ever truly left. But they were young, reckless. It was all just a story, wasn't it? Rafi smirked, holding up his phone. 15 minutes inside. We record it, prove it's all fake, and we go viral. Who's in? Tisha hesitated. My grandmother used to say. Oh, come on, Tisha, Niloy interrupted. It's just an old cemetery. Let's get this over with. With a deep breath, Aeon pushed the gate open. The hinges groaned loudly as a gust of cold wind rushed past them. And then, they stepped inside. 2. The Forgotten Names. The moment they entered, the temperature dropped. Aeon turned on his flashlight, casting eerie shadows over the cracked tombstones. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. Tisha stopped suddenly, pointing at a grave. "Look, the name is almost erased." They crouched down to examine it. The letters were faded, barely readable. S-A-N-T-A-N-U. Santanu. Raffi whispered. The moment he said it, a strange breeze blew past them, carrying a sound, like a whisper. San-ta-nu. Aeon laughed nervously. "It's just the wind." But then, something moved. A shadow, standing behind a tree. Tall, unmoving, watching. Before they could react, it was gone. "Did you see that?" Niloy whispered. No one answered. 3. The open grave. Deeper into the graveyard, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a freshly dug grave. "But this place has been abandoned for years," Tisha said, her voice trembling. "Who would dig a new grave here?" Raffi shined his phone light at the wooden marker beside it. The inscription read, "Welcome home, my children." The moment Aeon read it aloud, the ground rumbled. A deep, guttural groan echoed from beneath them. Then, a skeletal hand burst out of the grave. Tisha screamed. A second hand followed. Something was clawing its way out. They turned to run, but the graveyard had changed. The paths were no longer the same. It was like the graveyard had twisted itself into a maze. 4. The unfinished funeral. The thing that crawled out was barely human. Its rotting skin hung in shreds, and its eyes were empty black voids. It opened its mouth, and a whispering sound filled the air, 1,000 voices speaking at once. "You should not have come." They ran, but no matter which path they took, they kept ending up back at the open grave. And then, they saw them. Figures stood among the tombstones. Silent, watching, their faces twisted in agony. They weren't alive. Tisha clutched Aeon's arm. "There, the ones who never left." The creature stepped forward, its voice like dry leaves whispering in the wind. "One must stay. 5. The price of entry." The wind howled, the ground shook, and a force pulled at them, dragging them toward the grave. "No. We came together, we leave together." Aeon shouted. But the spirits surged forward. Ghostly hands reached for them. Raffi tripped, screaming as bony fingers clawed at his ankle. Aeon grabbed a rusted iron cross from a grave and swung it wildly. The spirits recoiled. "Run." They sprinted toward the gate. This time, they saw it. With all their strength, they pushed through the iron bars, collapsing onto the road. Silence. The graveyard was still again. They turned back. Niloy was missing. And there, beyond the locked gate, he stood. Inside the graveyard, his face pale, his mouth open in a silent scream. The whispering wind carried one final message. One must stay. The gate slammed shut. Niloy's body crumbled into dust. 6. The last message. They ran. They didn't stop until they were far from the graveyard. Only when they reached the village did they dare to check their phones. Aeon's phone was still recording. With trembling hands, he played the video. At first, it showed exactly what they remembered. The old graves, the whispering wind. Then, the screen glitched. For a moment, a figure appeared, a gaunt man in tattered burial clothes. "Santanu." The whispers grew louder. And then, Niloy's voice. A whisper. "Help me." The screen cut to black. And at that moment, Niloy's name faded from their memories. Like he had never existed. It was a cold, foggy evening when Clara, a young woman in her late 20s, decided to visit the old, abandoned graveyard on the outskirts of her town. The graveyard had been the subject of whispers and rumors for as long as she could remember. Some said it was cursed, others claimed to hear eerie whispers coming from it at night. But Clara, being a skeptic, had always dismissed the stories as nothing more than superstition. The cemetery was hidden away behind a crumbling stone wall, covered with vines and moss. It was a place that time seemed to have forgotten, with tombstones weathered by decades of neglect. The gates creaked ominously when she pushed them open, and the air felt heavier with each step she took. She had heard about the graveyard from an old man in the town's bar a few weeks ago. He mentioned that a series of strange deaths had occurred near the graveyard in the last century. Curious and a little intrigued, Clara had decided to visit, not believing for a second that anything supernatural could be happening there. As Clara wandered deeper into the cemetery, the fog thickened around her, swallowing up the last rays of daylight. The tombstones cast long, distorted shadows in the moonlight, and the silence was so absolute that her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. Then, just as she reached the far corner of the graveyard, Clara noticed something strange. There was a single tombstone that stood out from the rest. It was newer than the others, and the name engraved on it was unfamiliar: Eleanor Hawthorne. Clara leaned in closer, reading the inscription, which gave no date of birth but mentioned that Eleanor had passed away at the age of 34. A chill ran down her spine, and for a moment, she thought she heard something like a soft whisper. She quickly dismissed it as the wind. But the whispering grew louder, almost as if it was coming from the very earth beneath her feet. It wasn't the wind. It was words, a language she couldn't quite understand. Clara's curiosity got the better of her, and she crouched down to examine the grave. As she did, the ground beneath her trembled slightly, and the air grew colder. Her breath came out in visible clouds, but the temperature didn't seem to drop any further. The whispers became clearer, and Clara could swear she heard her name. Clara. Frozen in place, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She quickly stood up, scanning the graveyard. There was no one in sight, only the fog, the moon, and the eerie tombstones. Clara. The voice came again, but this time, it was louder, almost as if it was standing right behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing. No one. Panic set in, and Clara turned to leave, but her feet refused to move. She looked down at the grave again. This time, the inscription seemed to have changed. It was no longer the name Eleanor Hawthorne that was engraved on the stone, but rather her own name. Clara Woodson. Confused and terrified, Clara stepped backward, only to feel her foot sink into something soft, something damp. Looking down, she saw that the ground beneath her was shifting. The soil seemed to part, revealing an opening, a small, hidden grave. There was something in it, a body wrapped in tattered cloth, its pale, decaying hands reaching out as if it were calling to her. Before Clara could react, the whispers turned into frantic mutterings, voices rising in a crescendo. She felt as though the very air around her was thick with tension, and her breath grew shallow. The ground beneath her began to shake, and the tombstones around her rattled, their stone faces seemingly turning toward her. Suddenly, the earth split open. The grave of Eleanor Hawthorne was no longer just a grave, it had become a portal. Cold hands shot out of the ground, grabbing her ankles. She screamed, trying to pull herself free, but the hands only tightened their grip, dragging her toward the opening. A voice, deep, mournful, and filled with a sorrow that seemed to come from the very depths of hell, whispered in her ear. "You shouldn't have come. Now, you'll join us." Clara fought with all her strength, but it was no use. The hands dragged her closer to the portal, and with one last scream, she was pulled into the earth. Days later, when the townspeople noticed Clara's disappearance, they searched the graveyard. They found her belongings scattered near the entrance, but Clara was never seen again. The graveyard remained as it always had, silent, forgotten, and abandoned. But the whispers continued, faint but ever present. And anyone brave, or foolish, enough to visit after dark would hear the same words echoing through the fog. Clara. And sometimes, just sometimes, a figure could be seen wandering among the tombstones, her face twisted in eternal torment. Whispers on Blackpeak Mountain. Deep in the heart of the Himalayas, a forbidden peak loomed over the valley. Blackpeak Mountain was cursed, the villagers said. No one who climbed it ever returned. The stories were enough to scare most people away, except for Daniel and his team. Daniel, an experienced mountaineer, had spent years conquering the world's deadliest summits. But Blackpeak fascinated him. He didn't believe in curses, only in challenges. So, he and his 3 companions, Mark, Lisa, and Aaron, set out to conquer the haunted mountain. The ascent. The climb started smoothly, but as they ascended past the tree line, an eerie silence settled around them. The wind, which had howled below, suddenly stopped. Not even the crunch of their boots in the snow seemed to make a sound. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the wind carrying distant voices. But soon, they were everywhere. Words they couldn't understand. Some sounded close, others far away. Lisa froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Just the wind," Aaron said, though his voice wavered. But there was no wind. The cabin. That night, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a wooden cabin, abandoned and half buried in the snow. Strange, since no one was supposed to live here. They decided to rest inside. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood. The whispers grew louder. In the middle of the night, Mark jolted awake. Someone was breathing next to him. But when he turned his flashlight on, there was no one there, only a deep impression in the snow beside his sleeping bag. Then the door slammed open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, thin, its face hidden by shadows. It didn't move. It just watched. Lisa screamed. The flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. The descent into madness. The next morning, they decided to turn back. But something was wrong. Their tracks from the day before had vanished. The mountain had erased them. Then Aaron disappeared. One moment he was walking with them, the next, he was gone. No scream, no sign of a struggle. Only the whispers, growing louder, laughing. Night fell again. Daniel and the remaining two huddled together, barely sleeping. Lisa sobbed, whispering to herself. Mark held his ice axe tight, staring into the darkness. Then Lisa stood up. Without a word, she walked into the snow, her eyes blank. Lisa. Daniel ran after her, but the moment he grabbed her, she turned and smiled. Her eyes were pitch black. "You should not have come," she whispered. Then she vanished into the blizzard. The last survivor. By morning, it was just Daniel. The whispers were deafening now, speaking his name. He ran. He didn't stop until he reached the base of the mountain. When the villagers found him, his face was frozen in terror. He never spoke again. Years later, another team attempted to climb Black Peak. They found an old wooden cabin, its walls covered in deep scratches. And outside, half buried in the snow, was a camera. The last recording, Lisa staring into the lens, her eyes black as the abyss. "You should not have come."